This is the video lecture for Chapter 2 of American Government, and we'll be breaking Chapter 2 down into several sections because a lot we want to talk about, particularly since we're getting into the Constitution. Ultimately, this part will be talking about why we actually have a Constitution. So I want to summarize quite a bit as to American independence. First of all, you could say that the British colonists were descendants of the Western European expansionists, which had pretty much conquered the world, so to speak, during colonialism. So you could certainly argue that it was inevitable that by being separated by the Atlantic Ocean in their own territory, that they would have probably pursued it eventually. The French and Indian War, which is the Britain versus French, and the French recruited the Indians in the Northern Territories there. This was somewhat of a turning point because the British colonists there in America were given somewhat more independence in fighting that war. Yes, the British did finance the war, but they did give the British colonists there quite a bit of autonomy to fight that war, so that emboldened the British colonists a little bit more to start feeling a little bit more separate from the British Empire itself. And then there was a series of acts, mostly really putting additional taxes and things on goods and services. And so this brought up the concept of taxation without representation that really started to grow into more of an irritation. So we have the Sugar Act, the Currency Act, the Stamp Act, the Quartering Act, which did various things as far as imposing either taxes or obligations upon the British colonists. 1767 Townshend Acts, a reaction to that, also provided additional duties on several different other types of products. And this led to an uprising in Boston, which led to the Boston Massacre, in which 5 colonists were killed in that resistance. Then the 1773 Tea Act, that essentially gave a monopoly on the tea trade to the British East India Company. That resulted in another protest, the Boston Tea Party, which about $1 million worth of tea in today's dollars were dumped into the Boston harbor, and then that led to retaliation by the British to even more coercive acts that literally had a little bit more military intervention. So it started to come to a head, and speaking of which, the Samuel Adams, who was one of the primary instigators of the Boston Tea Party there, is known for beer, so I always thought that was kind of interesting why he's known for beer rather than tea. Anyway, independence was declared, and this is where we call the founding fathers that declared independence. They came together and wrote an Articles of Confederation, which was pretty much just a loosely held pact between sovereign states, which meant the 13 colonies were pretty much their own independent states. And that's part of the problem that we're going to get into here in a minute as far as why we have a constitution. The articles were ratified in 1781. The war was over. Surrender that year. Treaty of Paris established America, or the United States of America, as an independent country. But what most people don't realize is that the Constitution was written 11 years after we declared independence. It's because of this Articles of Confederation really did not give any power to a central government, which led to almost a fracturing of these original 13 states that then would require something to hold them together. Now, there were a few people, such as Alexander Hamilton and George Washington, that were already kind of looking ahead and saying that this this is not going to hold us together. Eventually, something's going to have to give. So, what were some of the problems? Well, right after independence, we saw that there's no more barter system. The barter system seemed to work pretty well for the colonies, where, for example, the wheat farmers of Massachusetts would take their product to the local general store, and the local general store would give them their supplies and their provisions to last them for the year. The general store would then take that wheat to the trading houses and the banks in Boston, and the general store would get its credit for all of its product that it would need locally. And then, of course, the shipping companies and the banks would then take that wheat, and then in some cases they'd send it to the West Indies market. And then once that got credited there, the London banks would then say, okay, now the Boston banks and the shipping companies there in Boston, now they are accredited with that product, and then the cycle's complete. So no money really had to change hands as long as the cycle flowed. But once independence was declared, then barter system was no more, had to pay money for goods as needed, and plus in any type of transition like that, there was an economic downturn and we started to see a recession. So economically, things started to get problematic very quickly because they needed money in order to pay for their goods and services, regardless of their crop. The farmers began defaulting on their debts. There was taxes were being raised because the states had to pay for that war. So raising taxes was also putting another burden on the farmers. The veterans, of course, of the Revolutionary War had been paid in war bonds to be redeemed later, and a very weak federal government was having problems doing that. So the farmers were selling their bonds to speculators who would then later cash in and make quite a bit of profit on that. But the farmers were the ones that were getting hurt on all sides here. So economically, it was becoming the problem. Now, because the states were pretty much entitled to do whatever they wanted to do, we started to see some conflict between the states here in our United States of America, which were not really united yet. Some states were coming up with their own currency. Now that could create problems, competition, and economic problems between states. We had some states that were still fighting over their borders. Some states were passing tariffs. These are taxes on imports against each other, charging them to use their ports. Some states were keeping their own navies, which could have been potentially problematic if there was a conflict that broke out. Probably, potentially, the worst case scenario was that one of the American states would pursue a treaty with another country. We see that Britain and France were still at odds, and they were eventually going to be at war later on anyway. And you could see the potential problems that could happen if one American state pursued a treaty with France, another state pursued a treaty with England. War would be highly, highly probable in that case. So there was some serious problems that were brewing very quickly after we gained independence. And George Washington himself, who had written about his concern even during the Revolutionary War, the troops were very attached to their states. For example, the New Jersey regiment would claim, we're fighting for New Jersey, when Washington would try to get the point across, well, you're fighting for the United States of America, but there was still attachment to the states. And he wrote here to a friend, what astonishing changes a few years are capable of producing. So it was getting fairly critical. Now, the Shays' Rebellion is the event that could be argued was the turning point, which really inspired movement. There had been talk about convention. There had been even some loose held plans to try to make a convention happen. Shays Rebellion pretty much iced that. Daniel Shays, he was a former sergeant in the Revolutionary War, fought bravely, decorated soldier, came back to run a farm in Massachusetts. And early on, when the economic problems started to hit, he was having money problems. He was charged with a 12-pound debt. Back in those days, you could go to jail for owning a debt. As I said before, since states were trying to pay off the war debt, well, Massachusetts, for example, owed their debt to a handful of powerful men, many of whom were connected to the state legislature. It was starting to get critical. The farmers were getting hit from all sides, and they were fairly powerless. So the states, such as Massachusetts and Virginia, New York, started to form their own little power structures. So Shays in particular was looking to rebel against the state of Massachusetts, trying to alleviate, or at least getting them to alleviate some of this problems they were having. He formed a band of veteran farmers and other sympathizers called the Regulators to push back against the increasing power of the state officials and state judges. So, as you could see, it was getting fairly critical that something was going to have to occur to try to get all the states back together. Shays' Rebellion started to build in 1786. 1,500 farmers marched on a Northampton courthouse there to kind of make a statement. About that time, the state militia was called out to try to push back against them. The federal government, which little power they had, tried to put together a federal force to try to guard against what might potentially happen here with this Shays Rebellion. In September, the Regulators performed a successful attack on a Springfield courthouse. No lives had been lost at this time. This was mostly demonstrations that could potentially break out into violence. And by the end of 1786, the Regulators numbered about 9,000, and they were pretty much spread across several states. Now, this gives you an idea of how serious this was, because Samuel Adams, who I referred to a few minutes ago, who was the chief instigator of the Boston Tea Party, now he's a respected member of the New Republic, and here he's talking about Daniel Shays when he says here, the man who dares to rebel against the laws of a republic ought to suffer death. So, yeah, could have some potential conflict breaking out here, and we did. But the Shays Rebellion pretty much peaked and ended pretty much on the same day. In January of 1787, Shays and his Regulators were planning an attack on a Springfield arsenal. So you could imagine if they could capture an arsenal, they would have a huge cache of weapons there that could take it to the next level or sustain them even further. So the state militia and federal troops come together. Word leaked out, and so they went to protect the arsenal before Shays' group got there. Some intrigue going on here as far as figuring out what's going on, getting there ahead of the Shays group to protect the arsenal. Shays troops then advance. Initially, cannons were fired as warning shots, but the Regulators may have felt pretty emboldened by their previous successes, so they had continued to advance on the arsenal there in Springfield. The head of the federal troops ordered the cannons shot directly into a column of Shays' men. 4 were killed instantly, and they scattered and retreated. A few weeks later, a lot of them were picked up. Many of them were charged with treason. So pretty much Shays' Rebellion was over, but it resulted in some conflict and death there. So the damage had been done, and the possibility of more of these rebellions breaking out against these various state powers there was still prevalent. So James Madison, the most preeminent figure at the Constitutional Convention, took the initiative to get this convention together. He knew that he was going to need George Washington to attend this convention in order to maintain its credibility. Shays' Rebellion was pretty good incentive to try to get together. As we'll see here in a minute, the Articles of Confederation were not doing that. They gave sovereignty to all the states. So the states themselves were not crazy about having a constitution that would override their power. So they pretty much agreed with Madison to hold this convention, but only for the purpose of amending the Articles of Confederation. Madison, I think it's pretty clear, Madison's intent from the very start was to write a new constitution to get everybody together. Now, we wanted a government, of course, a democratic form of a government that originated from the people, but there was a lot of sentiment there, particularly with much of the population not educated. There was a sentiment that the people were not really able to govern themselves. We needed to, again, put this in the hands of people who were capable of leading, but yet still be a democratic form of government. So that was a very tricky issue that they were going to have to address. So the framers, and that's what we're talking about here from here on out, the framers were the ones that were meeting in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787 to write a new constitution. Madison, of course, was very well prepared. He spent months studying democracies, even confederations, whatever it took to put something together, and felt like that Locke's concept of liberalism, which we've already talked about, would be kind of at the root of this system. Establish a rule of law with the Constitution, be very strong in providing individual civil liberties and property rights, also elections with the right to remove people from office, but yet at the same time keeping government fairly limited, as we'll get into here in a minute. Another inspiration for Madison was the writings of Montesquieu, a French philosopher, on the concept of separation of power, which we'll talk about more later on, and a central Enlightenment theme, which you could perhaps say that the Constitution represents somewhat of a culmination of the Enlightenment theme of understanding the individual human interest that is very natural to us, but at the same time devising a system that would channel man's self-interest into the public good. And this was also what Adam Smith had formulated in creating our modern economic systems, to channel man's self-interest in making money, for example, and to creating products that are for the public good. So we want to do the same thing politically here. So I'm going to talk about 4 basic points as to why we have the Constitution. The first, of course, is the need for a strong central government to keep things together and to maintain order, which was one of the purposes of government that we've already talked about. They also needed to address the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, since the federal government, as allocated in the Articles of Confederation, really had no authority over the sovereign states. They're fairly powerless. The states were pretty much doing whatever they wanted to do. That could potentially lead to their fracturing apart. The little states, such as Rhode Island, maybe New Jersey, Delaware, they felt powerless against the bigger states, such as Virginia and New York. Massachusetts was considered bigger and powerful. So that was another issue that they were going to have to address in the Constitution. The second thing that they had to address was this concept of pure democracy, which really doesn't exist anywhere in the world, and that's the concept of having the people as a whole legislate policy. The people as a whole may not be well educated, or we do know that humans are driven by their emotions and their passions, so therefore things can get out of hand fairly quickly. The Shays Rebellion was an example of that, where people were starting to come together. They could potentially swamp government as they form a majority. So they really wanted to kind of suppress the possibility of mob rule and insurrection by creating a system that would be a representative form of government. And as we'll talk about later on, the problem of factions, and that's groups of people coming together that are bound by some common impulse of passion or self-interest. And then once they come together, they could be violent, unruly. They could grow into what was called the tyranny of the majority. So that was another thing that the framers of the Constitution were concerned about. There was also the economic interests of the states, that if we could get them together. Hamilton was, of course, very foresightful. He was also our first Secretary of the Treasury. Hamilton had been advocating for a while, as we saw in our earlier slide, trying to get a convention together to get everybody on the same page. He felt like that if all of the states, particularly when you look at the size of our territory and the potential of our economic power, he felt that if we could get the states together economically rather than operating on their own self-interests and passing tariffs against each other and all that kind of stuff, he felt like that America had become an economic power on par with the British Empire, and he was correct. It took a while, but getting all the states economically together was a very powerful idea. Had we not done that, it's quite possible that the South would have kept their agrarian slave system, probably would have split off much earlier, remained somewhat of a developing country for quite a long time. The federal government needed power to regulate commerce in order to do that, and then to collect taxes, and also to pay their debts. The idea was that the federal government would be the lender of last resort, that would provide the credible foundation of the economy. There was also the personal interest of the framers that started to kind of fall by the wayside. Yes, there was certain people there at the convention who had their own personal interests. Some of them owned public securities that needed a federal government to back them. There was quite a few landowners, creditors, merchants, shippers, property owners that clearly had their own self-interest in mind. All 55 of the white men who attended the Constitutional Convention at one time or another were relatively wealthy men, comparatively speaking. But as we'll see, it's the long-term thinking of trying to create a system that's sustainable, that was pretty much spearheaded by James Madison and Alexander Hamilton and supported by George Washington. Those are the thinkers that really prevailed in order to create this Constitution that was extremely important to keeping the United States together and setting the framework for its success. So therefore, these personal economic interests did not really derail the long-term political priorities that were very much needed. Now, the fourth thing is that the framers did understand that we can't create a system where the federal government is too strong. We have to get this thing ratified, so the states are going to have to accept this. So we have to make sure that we have a representative republic where people understand that they are sending people to federal government to govern the entire country. They also did not want to dissolve the states. That more than likely would have not got improved if they'd done that. So they kept what is called a federal system. So the states kept their own government. So what we have is a central federal government that operates separately from the state governments. Even though it is the supreme power, it does, as we'll see, delegate a lot of power to the states. So that was instrumental in setting up this system. They also devised the separation of powers for the federal government, where you have three branches of government: the legislative branch, which makes the laws; the executive branch, which the president is over, that executes the laws; and the judicial branch, which therefore will then interpret the laws. This is a very complicated system, interestingly enough, that a lot of people still don't understand to this day, but very crucial in the survival of our young United States of America. I think there's not a whole lot of argument among scholars and academics that if we had not done this, if we had not put this Constitution together, the United States would have broken apart fairly soon. So the main controversies were, of course, that the small states were worried that a representative system was not going to do them any good. They were going to be overpowered by the big states. And the Great Compromise is, you could argue the Great Compromise is what saved the Constitution, because what they decided to do was, in the Congress, they split the Congress up into two houses, and that's partly because since they're the lawmaking branch, they wanted a little bit more of a kind of an agreement there so that the Congress would not be too powerful. So they wanted to split that into two houses. But in addition, they gave equal representation to all states in the Senate. And that appeased the small states enough to where they could continue on. They also were wary of a president that was too powerful, because they did not want a monarch. They did not want a king system. So they created the Electoral College, which we'll talk about in more detail later on. But again, the Electoral College was a way of filtering the votes through representatives who would then cast the ballots for president. And again, the idea there was to try to prevent a president that could inspire mob rule, become a demagogue, and have a majority that could really come onto his side and then take over the other branches of government. They also, this is what compromises do. The slavery was an issue that they were not able to really address. States that were pro-slavery, they would not been able to resolve that at that time. So the 3/5 compromise allowed that states with slaves would count a slave as 3/5 of a person. And even though that slave could not vote, that did give those southern states a little bit more representative power. But again, that was a compromise that, in order to get the states together. Now, we did have a problem with slavery for several decades after that resulted in the Civil War that we'll touch on later. But this is what compromises do. They had to come together with something that would keep the states intact. Otherwise, we might not be here. Another interesting controversy was the Western territories, that they were considered somewhat less than equal to the states that were already established, the barbaric Westerners out there. But they eventually resolved that and said Western territories, as long as they went through the proper process, that they would be allowed equal statehood. So the Constitution was submitted within about 5 months or so, in September 1787. The Anti-Federalists needed a little bit more reassurance. The Federalist Papers were published. Those were written primarily by James Madison and Alexander Hamilton. Those were very important. It helped explain the rationale of this Constitution. The Constitution was ratified by June 1788, when 9 states ratified it. Now, one of the things that they promised during that ratification process there was that a Bill of Rights would be submitted by Congress. So that was a promise that would kind of appease the anti-federalists, and the states would therefore have their a little bit more comfort in the federal government had its own Bill of Rights as well, even though each state would have its own Bill of Rights. It was still part of the process to get the Constitution approved. What I want to do then is stop this section, and I'll start it up again with the next video lecture talking about in more detail what's actually in the Constitution.